So we'll be in Revelation chapter 11 tonight. 10 tonight. I looked at 11 on my Bible, but we'll be in chapter 10. In the midst of everything that we've been reading, just fast-paced, events happening, chapter 10 is kind of an interlude to everything that's taken place. You'll see John changes the vision, what he's seeing, it changes. It's a shorter chapter, only 11 verses, and so there's just a change in things. But to bring you just kind of to catch up where we left off, 2 weeks ago we looked at Revelation chapter 8, and that was the beginning of the trumpet judgments. So God held a scroll in heaven, and that was a title deed to the earth. That was the kingdom of his. Satan had usurped the earth, being the prince of this world, in the garden. Jesus had taken all that back when he died on the cross, but he hasn't established his kingdom on the earth. And that was the scroll in God's hand, was the title deed to the earth, is a way to look at it. It was sealed with 7 seals. Each of those 7 seals revealed a judgment. And so we go through the first 6, and when the 7th one is open, it opens 7 trumpet judgments. Those 7 trumpet judgments are what we started reading 2 weeks ago, and we got through the 6th one last week. Now, how John writes is, for whatever reason, how he's seeing the visions, he always pauses after the 6th. So we got through 6 seals, and he paused. And it changed. And he talked about the 144,000. And he talked about the great multitude in heaven. And then he went to the 7th seal, which opened up the trumpets. Same thing here. He goes through the 6 trumpets. And now we're going to take a 2-chapter interlude. Well, a chapter and a half interlude. We're going to read today about the uniqueness of all this unfolding. And there's a descriptive angel that we'll read about. Next week we'll do chapter 11, which gets into the 2 witnesses. And then we get the 7th trumpet. When the 7th trumpet blows, this will be almost at the very end of things. The 7th trumpet will lead to 7 bowls. And those are just purely the wrath of God being poured out. And those come very quickly, one right after the other. And those lead into the Battle of Armageddon and ultimately to Christ establishing his kingdom. And so we're really close to those things. And so we're towards the end. The first 3.5 years of tribulation, what we believe is going to be very much a time of peace. I'm not saying there's not going to be some discontentment in the midst of that, but the second half of that, the last 3.5 years, is what we call the Great Tribulation. And this is when Satan is bound to the earth. All the demons who were in the air, in the heavens, no longer are there. They're bound to the earth. Those demons who were actually enchained in the abyss, in the bottomless pit, they are released. The 4 angels at the Euphrates River are released. And so literally hell is on earth for that season. And God allows some authority to them to kill. And so up until this chapter, half of the population has been killed in the tribulation through these various things. Through war, through the demons being allowed to take them out. I want you to just imagine the chaos that's unfolding. That literally, at this moment, when John is reading and when John is seeing this vision, that there are demons who are actually murdering men. It's incredible to think about. That they're wiping out 1/3 of the population, and they are given the authority to do that. It's an incredible thing to think about, that hell on earth is literally unfolding. And so, as all of this is unfolding, we get to chapter 10. This short chapter is really unique. In some sense, it almost seems out of place, but it is perfectly in place. And so, as opposed to how I normally do, where I read the chapter and then I go over it, we're going to go through it verse by verse, and I want to talk about some of the things within it. And then at the very end, any questions you have. There was some depth that I didn't go into last week that I may touch on, but I want to make sure we get chapter 10 behind us right now. And so we'll just go verse by verse through it, and I'll explain some of the things as we go through it, and And then at the end, if anything you have a question about, I'll do my best to try to answer it. So chapter 10, starting in verse number 1, John is writing, "Then I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven, wrapped in a cloud, with a rainbow over his head, and his face was like the sun, and his legs like pillars of fire." Now that's an introduction, you know. I mean, if you're going to write some kind of graphic novel, this would be a wonderful introduction to who the person is. So one is, I want you to see how John starts. He says, "Then I saw." That's how John transitions from one vision to the next. And so if you were to look back at chapter 9, you would see that it just flows with chapter 8. It's all one vision being downloaded to John. John transitions. He says, "And then I saw." So he's looking here. He looks over here and says, "And then I saw." He begins to record to us. He said, "I saw another mighty angel." So notice it's different. Angels, 66 times we read about angels in the book of Revelation. There's only 2 times that we read about a mighty angel. And so notice he says another mighty angel. We'll read about another one in chapter 18 whenever Babylon falls. "I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven." And I want us to look at the description. He is wrapped in a cloud. So John's given us this figurative look at him. And remember, a lot of this is symbolic. I do not physically believe that you're going to see, if you were there at the time, see this. John is using figurative language to describe what's unfolding. Now, anytime we see clouds or something wrapped in clouds, we always draw from that it's referring to judgment. When Christ comes back in the clouds, we know that that's the judgment upon things. And so what John is painting the picture of here is that there's an angel who's coming down, a mighty angel. We don't know who it is. Some argue that it's Jesus. There's no proof whatsoever it's Jesus. I believe it's actually an angel. If anything, it could be Michael, who is typically described as that mighty angel. But it's a mighty angel nonetheless, who's coming down from heaven, and he's wrapped in a cloud. So he's coming down in judgment. Notice the next description is he has a rainbow over his head. Now when we think of rainbow, we go back to the book of Genesis chapters 6, 7, 8, 9, when we get into the story of the ark. And the rainbow has served and will always serve as a reminder of God's covenant with man. And so what we see here in this angel is a balance. There's the judgment of God balanced with the covenant of God. What does that mean? The judgment of God is for the wicked. The covenant of God is that God does not destroy those who are not wicked. We know that from the very end of the book of Malachi when we read about God's judgment. And he reminds through the prophet Malachi that he separates the just from the unjust, the righteous from the unrighteous. His covenant is that he spares the righteous and he brings judgment upon the unrighteous. So the angel is in judgment. He's wrapped in the covenant of God. And his face was like the sun, and his legs like pillars of fire. When we read about angels in Scripture, we always get this depiction of them, unless they take on the form of a human, we get this depiction of them in this glorious view. We see very descriptive language when Ezekiel writes about angels. We get this description of their illumination, of how they shine, to the point that they could actually light up the area that they're in. So when we look at this, the interesting thing is to think about how God illuminates. If you remember, God's glory shone, but Moses could not look at him because he could not stand to look at his glory. But the angel is coming down with the glory of God. So he has the judgment, the covenant of God, the glory of God, and his legs are like pillars of fire. So that too is just a reminder of how God judges the earth, that fire is a form of judgment. We go to verse 2. He had a little scroll open in his hand, and he set his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land, and called out with a loud voice, down to verse number 3, like a lion roaring. When he had called out, the 7 thunders sounded. So he has a little scroll in his hand. Some would argue that this scroll that he has in his hand is the scroll of that we read about earlier, that God holds and then Jesus takes and begins to remove the seals from. At this time, obviously, all 7 of the seals would have been opened. And so some would say that this is that scroll, and the description of it being little is just really played into the fact of how mighty the angel is. I actually believe that this is a different scroll. You're going to see something in just a little bit that I think supports that. I believe this is a different scroll that has very specific things in there for John, that John is to read, but John is not to share. So this angel has this little scroll in his hands, and he calls out with a loud voice like a lion roar, and so giving us this picture of how loud it is. And when he called out, the 7 thunders sounded. This isn't the first time this has happened. If we go to the book of Psalms, we find about the 7 thunders of God. But we have the loud noise that then brings about 7 thunders. Now, remember that thunder and lightning tend to always accompany the judgment of God. We saw it whenever Jesus died, that we had this earthquake, and the depiction we have is this loud noise that we believe to be a thunder. And so we a lot of times get the thunder of God in support of the judgment of God. In verse number 4, and when the 7 thunders had sounded, I was about to write, but I heard a voice from heaven saying, seal up what the 7 thunders have said, and do not write it down. Now, if you remember, in chapter 1, when Jesus is talking to John, he tells him to write down everything that he sees, right? And so John's whole purpose in the midst of all of these visions is to record everything that he sees. Except for whatever is unfolding here, which is the judgment of God. What most believe, as do I, is that the extent of the judgment of God here is so devastating that it's become a mystery that God doesn't even want John to reveal what is unfolding. Think about the shape that the earth is in. This is what you have to remember. Hell is loose on the earth. Literally. Hell is loose on the earth. But whatever judgment is accompanied with this mighty angel who roars like a lion, and the 7 thunders bring about some sort of judgment that is so severe, I believe, that God doesn't even allow John to write those things down because it wouldn't be something that we could read. So think about that, because we haven't even gotten to the 7 bowls, which are very significant judgments, but there's such significant judgment upon mankind in this moment that John can't even record it. And so when we keep moving from that, get to verse number 5, and the angel said, whom I saw standing on the sea and on the land, raised his right hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and what is in the earth, what is in it, the earth, and what is in it, and the sea, and what is in it, that there be no more delay. So the angel, and this to me is proof that it's not Jesus, he swore to God, and obviously Jesus being a part of the Trinity wouldn't have had to make that oath in that moment. But he makes an oath to God that there would be a delay no longer. Now what does that go back to? Remember chapter number 6, the martyrs screamed out that they wanted God's wrath to be poured out for their blood. And you remember the voice told them it wasn't time yet, that there was still more that would accompany them. Of course, we read about them in chapter number 8, when the great multitude comes. They're martyrs. Some of them are martyrs who come in that moment. But now, God is removing the delay of his judgment. And you're probably going, wait, hasn't his judgment been unfolding? To an extent. But God hasn't poured out his full wrath yet. The fact that men are still living is proof that God hasn't poured out his full wrath. Because God, in his righteousness, cannot tolerate unrighteousness. But he's allowed the delay, which is one of his greatest acts of mercy. He's allowed a delay. What most believe from here, and this is what I believe too, is that at this moment forward, you're going to see that God's wrath is no longer delayed. And I also believe that you will no longer see the regeneration of souls from this moment on. Now, we're at the very end of time. So people up until this point have had years. If they hadn't made things right before the rapture, they've had years to make those right decisions and acceptance and for the Holy Spirit to regenerate their heart. But from this moment forward, with the delay no longer being there, so God's removing his mercy upon mankind, that there will no longer be a regeneration of the soul. And for me, I think when we talk about the drive of evangelism from the book of Revelation, why I said that this chapter seems so out of place and unique and really insignificant, but the reality is it's very significant. And I think this is why. I think for me, when I think about evangelism when it comes to the book of Revelation, this is probably the most powerful thing. Because one is we see the judgment of God so severe that John cannot is not even allowed to record it. And then we find for the first time in all of humanity, God is removing his mercy. He's no longer delaying his judgment upon mankind. And so the angel makes an oath to God that he'll no longer delay it, that now things are about to unfold, and they're going to unfold in rapid succession. Then we pick up in verse number 7. But that in the days of the trumpet, call to be sounded by the seventh angel, the mystery of God would be fulfilled, just as he announced to his servants, the prophets. So in a continuation of that, we know now that we're fixing to lead into the final trumpet. If you remember, when we got to the fifth trumpet, it followed by an eagle who flew over, who said, "Woe, woe, woe." And those three woes were for the three final trumpets that were going to blow because of the severity of them. And though things were troubling before that, the severity of them was so significant that the eagle flew over and shouted, "Woe, woe, woe." So we're getting to the final of the three woes, and the mystery of God would be fulfilled. So the mystery of God, understanding what the judgment would no longer be a mystery. Understanding the mercies of God. Why does God withhold his wrath? Why doesn't God punish mankind for what they're doing? That mystery is no longer there. The mystery of mercy no longer exists. The mystery of God restraining his wrath no longer exists. The mystery of God's judgment no longer exists. The mystery would be removed just as the prophets and the servants prior to that had written about and proclaimed to the world. In verse number 8, then the voice that I heard from heaven spoke to me again, saying, "Go, take the scroll that is open in the hand of the angel who is standing on the sea and on the land." So I went to the angel and told him to give me the little scroll. And he said to me, "Take and eat. It will make your stomach bitter, but in your mouth it will be as sweet as honey." That's interesting, right? Now, this isn't the first time. If you've read the book of Ezekiel, you know Ezekiel was commanded to eat the scroll too. And so this isn't like the first time in all of history it's ever happened. God has actually commanded that before. As a matter of fact, one of the ways that the Jews would actually determine innocence or guilt is that they would take the accusations of someone and they would be blotted out, and they would take that and they would make them drink the ink and stuff that was blotted out, and the bitterness of it would make them either confess their innocence or their guilt. That was their belief. And so this isn't something that would be really uncommon to John as we read it. Now when we read it, we go, why would they eat that? But for John, this wouldn't be so crazy. And so the angel tells him, it's going to be sweet in your mouth, but it's going to be bitter in your stomach. And you're probably thinking, that's kind of different. Wouldn't it be bitter in your mouth and bitter in your stomach, or sweet in your mouth and sweet in your stomach? But remember, this is symbolic. Now, while John is probably physically eating this in the vision, the reality is symbolic. Remember, the words of God, as we read about in Proverbs, are sweet as honey. We know that's what entices us. When we read the words of our Creator, it's sweet to our lips. It's sweet to our mouth. When we speak those words, it's sweet to us. These are the words of God. And what is written on this, we don't know. Whether it be something personal to John, whether it be some judgment that is to come. Some would say that it might be chapter 11. Some say it might be some of the other ones that are about to come. Whatever it may be, it's still the words of God recorded on a scroll. Taking in the words of God is sweet to us. And it's sweet in this moment. It's symbolic. We know because of the sweetness that it's the words of God. We also know, because of the bitterness in his stomach, that most likely those words involve some sort of judgment. Because the judgment of humanity is bitter to us. When I talk about it, doesn't it make your stomach curl going, oh my God, this is what people are going to have to go through? They're going to go through this and this and this. It's bitter to us because we don't want people to go through that. And so what this symbolically represents is the sweetness of the words of God accompanied by the bitterness of his judgment on mankind. And then we pick back up in verse number 10. And I took the scroll from the hand of the angel and ate it. It was sweet as honey in my mouth, but when I had eaten it, my stomach was made bitter. And I was told, you must again prophesy about many peoples and nations and languages and kings. So John was restricted from recording what he saw with the thunders. He then took the little scroll from the angel, he ate it, and then he's given the authority to what? To begin recording things again. And so what he is told to do after this is he has to again prophesy about the many peoples and nations and languages and kings. And so John is reinstated in that role where he is to record everything that he sees. And so that brings us to the end of that chapter. And again, to me, it is a glimpse into the urgency of evangelism that we have. Is that the judgment of God is something so troubling when we read about it. But also understanding that God's mercy, which we lean on every single day, will come to an end. And in the exit of God's mercy is most likely the removal of the regeneration of the heart. And those people then, in that moment, you're going to see the two witnesses are about to be taken out. The 144,000 are about to be taken out. I mean, literally, it's going to get ugly really fast. And I believe that God no longer will regenerate hearts. And so anyhow, any questions that you may have about that or anything previous to that?
And that's about half the world's population, right?
Yeah. Yep, half of them have been wiped out. Just in this stuff. That's not counting maybe people who have died from other things, but definitely half of the world's population have been wiped out. So another half still remains. Anyone? Next week we'll get into Revelation 11. I'll give you my thoughts on the two witnesses next week, who I think they are, why I think they are who they are. But remember, minor theories. I don't want to be here to find out who it is, but minor theories. And so, that could be someone else. We don't know who they are. Or we give some evidence that we think they are. And then last thing, and I swear I'll be really quick on it. I didn't go into detail last week. One is I was really trying to get everything in, and two is I wanted to give you a moment to kind of digest because it was a lot. But last week when I talked about chapter 9, especially when I talked about the demon locust that is described in the fifth trumpet that's being blown, let me give you my thoughts on those. I just kind of covered them and gave a lot of background to it, but there's two thoughts on what they physically are. Some would tell you that physically they take on the form of a locust, as similar to as John describes them. Remember that angels, fallen angels, demons, they don't have a created body. They are spirit. They don't have a body. So they have to take on a form of something. And so some would tell you that they would then become these demonic locusts who sting people with their scorpion sting and so on and so forth. That's one theory. My belief is that John uses that figurative language to help us understand the multitude of them, to understand the power of them, and understand the time of them, 5 months, which is the lifespan of a locust. John uses locusts in that way. I believe that when they are released from the abyss, remember they're the worst of the worst, that's why they're bound, that they will actually possess people. And here's why I believe that. I heard someone describe when someone gets stung by a scorpion. It says it's not uncommon because of the excruciating pain for them to roll on the ground, foam at the mouth, and speak like an unintelligible language. And when we read in the Gospels, especially about demon possession, those are many times the descriptions that we'll see. Foaming at the mouth, and even if you've ever heard of someone's encounter with someone who's demon possessed, foaming at the mouth, and excruciating pain, intelligible language. Also, when we read in the Gospels, there is a man who had the legion of demons in him. If you remember, he was trying to harm himself, literally trying to kill himself, but the demons wouldn't let him kill himself. If you remember, they have no authority to kill you. So you're going to do everything you can to escape it. But so if you believe that they don't possess the body, then you would have to believe if I shot myself in the head, it wouldn't kill me. I would just be disfigured. You'd have to believe if I stabbed myself, I wouldn't kill myself. Or, if you believe what I believe, in their possession, they're going to control you. they're going to make sure you harm yourself, but they have no power to kill you. So I believe that it's a physical demon possession by millions of demons who are bound in the abyss. So they're going to be running rampant over mankind, which makes the next one even more in line, because then after 5 months, the power is given to the demons to kill 1/3 of mankind. So now the same ones who were possessing you now have the power to kill you, which is ultimately what they want to do anyhow. They don't want to torture you for 5 months, they want to kill you. So those are my beliefs on that. But like I said, I wanted to give it some time and let that sink in. Any questions?
Have you ever known anybody that was on the thing with me?
I haven't physically encountered it. I've heard stories about it. Grew up in church and it happened. They cast a demon out. I'll tell you, Robbie can probably speak this too. There's many inmates that I came in contact with that I believe that they were possessed. And I will just tell you, there was like an oppression that you felt. There was the way that they weren't with you. I felt that, but there was no verification. It was just something I felt. So, yeah. That's what I always say when we talk about God. He's omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. Satan and the demons are none of those things. So these lunatics who pray to Satan, Satan might be at the throne of God snitching. He might be in Russia. He might be in, he's not listening to you like God listens to our prayers. And so, and the same thing with demons. There's not enough of them on the earth to possess us, because remember, there's millions that are bound. They're in the atmosphere, waging that war. They're also all over the world, and so they're spread out. That's why I said when they're released and they're confounded to the earth, and then you're talking about, a good third of the earth is already taken out. They're going to then be able to individually impact people, which would be something never experienced in all of humanity. So it would be different. So let's close with prayer. God, thank you for tonight. We thank you for your words. May they continue to push us to evangelism. And may we continue to feel the urgency in our souls to spread your good news. And God, again, I pray tonight for each one of these names that were on our list. May you continue to bless and be with them, comfort them, give them peace. And God, just be their physician in these troubling times. And God, we again ask your blessings upon our community, our country. Lord, may you continue to be what we turn our eyes to in the midst of all this chaos. Lord, when we don't understand how things are going to move forward, we solely lean upon you. And today, God, we do that. We don't understand a lot of this going on. We understand the chaos is just part of how things will unfold. But Lord, help us to have faith in you, to share the gospel in the midst of this, to hurting people, and continue to be a light that shines bright in those that we encounter. God, be with each and every person. Pray that you bless them this week. Help them, Lord, to be the influencer that you've called them to be. These things we ask in Christ's name.